Salvete discipuli et discipuli. Today's review is going to be on verbs. So the first thing I want to talk about are the characteristics of Latin verbs. Okay, so in Latin, a verb is going to have 5 characteristics. Okay, it's going to have person, number, tense, voice, and mood. There are some other verbal things out there like infinitives and participles, and they're not going to have person, number, tense, voice, mood. But if it's the main verb of a sentence or a clause, it's going to have person, number, tense, voice, and mood. Okay. By person, I'm referring to first, second, or third person. Number is either singular or plural. There are 6 tenses in Latin. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about them in a second. But the present, imperfect, future, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect. There is the active and passive voice, and there are 3 moods: the indicative, the imperative, and the subjunctive. Now, the subjunctive you learned more specifically in Latin too. We're going to hold off on reviewing that. We're only going to review the indicative and the imperative in this video. The principal parts are all the forms that you need to fully conjugate a verb. Okay, so you cannot fully conjugate a verb unless you have the principal parts. Each of the principal parts is a specific form. So for example, the first principal part is the first person singular present active indicative. Okay, the second principal part is the present active infinitive. Now, in addition to it being the present active infinitive, you get the present stem from the second principal part, and you can tell what conjugation the verb is in from the second principal part. The third principal part is the first person singular perfect active indicative, and you get the perfect active stem from it. And then the fourth principal part is the perfect passive participle, and we need that in order to form the perfect passive, pluperfect passive, and future perfect passive indicative, and subjunctive for that matter. When I talk about the various tenses in Latin, I'm going to say the present system and the perfect system. The tenses that make up the present system are the present, imperfect, and future. They are called the present system because they form using the present stem. The perfect system, the perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, are so called because they form using the perfect stem. Okay? Now, in order to conjugate a verb, you need to get your stem, okay? So if you're going to conjugate it in the present system, you need the present stem. Now, you get the present stem in different ways depending on the conjugation of the verb. For first and second conjugation verbs, you get the present stem by removing the RE from the second principal part, which means when you get your present stem, it has a vowel on the end of it, okay? So if we were to look at the paradigm verb amo, amare, if we remove that RE from the second principal part, our present stem is ama. Same with teneo. Teneo, tenere, we remove that RE from the second principal part, and you get tene. You have a present stem with a vowel on the end of it. However, for the third, third io, and fourth, you get the present stem by removing the entire ERE or IRE from the second principal part, which means that when you do that, you do not have a vowel on the end of your present stem. So for example, the present stem for the third conjugation paradigm verb ago, the second principal part is agere, which means our present stem is ag, right? For facio, it's fac. For audio, it's aud, which means you do not have a vowel on the end of your present stem. And that's going to be important in how we form the present and the future for third, third io, and fourth. Regardless of the conjugation of the verb, the perfect active stem is formed the same way for all conjugations, okay? So you remove the I from the third principal part. So our perfect stem for amo is amau. For teneo is tenu. For ago is egg. For facio is fake, and for audio is adib. Okay? Okay. The next thing we need to talk about before I give you examples of all the conjugations are the 2 additional things you can do with verbs, okay? One thing is you can make a verbal adjective that's called a participle. Participles do not have mood because they cannot be the main verb in a sentence. Instead, participles describe nouns just like adjectives always do. But these are adjectives that have some kind of verbal component to them, right? Like, for example, back in the late 80s, early 90s, the dance craze, the running man. The running man, running is describing man. So it's an adjective, but run and running are verbal, right? They have these aspects of action, which is what a verb is. Because of this, participles do not have person, number, tense, voice, mood, but they do have tense and voice. And because they're adjectives, of course, they have gender, number, and case, and they can describe a noun by being in the same gender, number, and case. When I say participial phrases, what I mean is a participle plus its predicate. Now, because a participle can have tense and voice, it can take a predicate, either a direct object or an ablative of means, ablative of agent. Anything that can be in the predicate for a main verb can be in the predicate for a participle too. That participle plus its predicate is called a participial phrase. Now, there are a total of 4 participles in Latin, but you have only learned 2 so far, so we're only going to review the 2 that you learned in Latin 1. The first one is the perfect passive participle. That is the 4th principal part. The second is the future active participle, which is the 4th principal part plus urus, ura, urum, okay? Now, you can remember this because that UR and urus, right, is telling you that it's future, which has a UR in it. So there you go. I have 2 sentences here, one using a perfect passive participle, one using a future active participle. Consul a populis omnibus amatus, Romam ex hostibus servavit. So, our main sentence is consul servavit. The consul saved. And if we can translate this sentence without the participle, because the participle is just giving us additional information, it says that the consul saved Romam, direct object, Rome, ex hostibus, from the enemy, ablative of separation, okay? Now, we also have this participial phrase in here. We have the participle amatus, which is the 4th principal part of the verb amo, which means this is the perfect passive participle, and it is in the nominative singular masculine. So if this is an adjective that has to be describing a noun in the sentence, then it is describing the nominative singular masculine consul, okay? Consul. So the consul, having been loved or loved ab populis omnibus, ablative of agent, by all the people, saved Rome from the enemy, okay? Participles in the end just give additional information, right? They just give you a little bit more information about any given noun in the sentence, okay? So you can translate a sentence without them, but they do bring a little something extra, okay? Our second sentence, populus Romanus militibus urbem discessoris gratias agit. Okay, so if we just ignore our participial phrase for a second, we have populus Romanus agit gratias, right? The Roman people give thanks or thank the militibus, the soldiers, discurris. This is nominative, dative, plural, describing the other nominative, dative, plural in the sentence militibus. So the soldiers about to depart or about to leave Urbem, the city. Okay. The other special verb form that you have learned are infinitives. Technically, infinitives are verbal nouns, but that's not as important as you know how to translate them. Okay. There are 5 infinitives that you have learned: the present active and passive, the perfect active and passive, and the future active. The present active infinitive is the 2nd principal part. The present passive infinitive is the first is formed differently based on the conjugation of the verb. So first, second conjugation verbs form their present passive infinitive by taking the 2nd principal part, removing the final E and replacing it with an I. And you'll see examples of that when I go through the conjugations. The third principle, the third IO, and 4th conjugations form their present passive infinitive by removing the entire ERE or IRE from the second principal part and replacing it with a long I. And again, you'll see examples of that when I go through the conjugations. The perfect active infinitive is the perfect stem plus the ending isse. The perfect passive is the fourth principal part, which is the first word, and then the second word is always esse. And the future active infinitive is the future active participle, which is our first word, and esse, which is our second word. Now, knowing how to form the infinitives are one thing, but knowing how to use them is something else. There are two very common uses of the infinitive. The first is the complementary infinitive, and the second is the indirect statement. Complementary infinitives complete the meaning of certain verbs. So among the most common of these verbs are debere, to ought, posse, to be able, and solere, to be accustomed. Okay, and I have a couple of examples here. Tuam familiam amare debes. You ought to love your family. You ought doesn't quite tell you everything you need to know about this action, right? So you need to complete the meaning of that action by including the complementary infinitive. You ought to love, okay? Our second sentence, fortes vincere hostes patuerunt. The brave men were able, vincere, to overcome the enemy. And again, they were able just doesn't give you enough information about the action. You need something a little bit more to complete the meaning, and that's where vincere, to conquer, comes in. The indirect statement is a construction in Latin that is set up by very specific type of verbs, okay? The types of verbs that set up indirect statement are called head verbs because they're things that you do using your head. Thinking and feeling, saying, hearing, or observing, okay? In English, we set up indirect statement by using a conjunction that, but the Romans didn't do that. Instead, the Romans would have this head verb and then have the subject of indirect statement put into the accusative, and then the actual action of the indirect statement was expressed through an infinitive, okay? And how we translate these into English are things like, I hear that, I feel that, I think that, so on and so forth, okay? So consider this example. Discipuli pauci putant, se Latinum sine industria discere posse, okay? Few students think. Now again, thinking is a head verb, so you should be anticipating an indirect statement at this point. Few students think that, say, they, posse discere, are able to learn Latinum, Latin, sine industria, without hard work or industry, so on and so forth. Such moralizing sentences, I realize. All right, gentlemen. At this point, I'm going to very quickly go through each of the conjugations. You should stop the video. You should pause it and take down these notes because I'm not going to be going through every single form with you. For the first conjugation, we have the present, imperfect, future, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect active and passive. And I have examples of each of the forms that you should know. The infinitives, the imperatives, which give commands, and the participle. I have the same setup for the second conjugation. And again, you should be pushing pause to get these forms down. Here is our example of third conjugation. I give you third IO because, of course, third IO is different from the third conjugation, similar to the fourth, but not identical. And you should be writing these down as well, all of them. I show you about this present passive infinitive here. And fourth conjugation. Now, in addition, I have also set up the forms of the verb to be, sum esse fui futurus, and the verb Possum, posse, patui, a compound of som, which means to be able. Okay? All right, I look forward to seeing you in class. Make sure you take good notes that I can see.